And what we realized very soon as that effort was launched is there was no way to manage the crowd, if you will, to task the crowd, to organize the information that's needed in order to make strategic decision making. So we worked with the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team and National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and some of the commercial imagery vendors to provide a process which we called imagery to the crowd, where we could serve up imagery that would allow volunteer mappers to select a particular area, work on a task, and very quickly provide the type of information that would be needed to fill in gaps in decision making. That imagery to the crowd project then matured into a State Department initiative that we call NapGive, which is part of the Open Government Initiative of the Department of State. And we started working with a number of partners and other organizations inside and outside the US government to launch a series of mapathons. And my office has specifically developed a project which will be featured the next 2 days called Secondary Cities, which is using the technology and the partnerships that we've developed over the past few years to try to provide missing data for vulnerable populations in rapidly growing urban areas around the world. So all of these efforts are really designed to create avenues for capacity building, to create open geographic information, to help largely vulnerable populations in areas of the world that are missing data. And the whole idea behind our Secondary Cities project that we'll be starting with today is that there's a lot of data that needs to be available for urban planning strategies, resiliency, disaster preparedness, and we need to identify growth areas where very often the local governments have not mapped the populations there, identify priority areas that the populations themselves can select as something that's needed, and urge partnerships with universities, NGOs, local governments, and the like. And Dr. Melinda Laturi, who was in my office last year as a Jefferson Science Fellow, and then went back to Colorado State University, where she runs the Geospatial Central, and is still engaged as a principal investigator of the Secondary Cities project. And after Mike gives his comments, Melinda will really launch us into the actual hands-on mapping activities. The whole idea behind mapathons, in my mind, is participation, and the key to participation is partnerships. And none of these mapathons can be as effective as they are when you can extend the partnership to include a whole series of different actors. And just in the brief couple of years that we've been helping to work on these mapathons, we've had a number of partners that they're mentioning: OpenStreetMap, the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team principally, USAID, Peace Corps, American Red Cross, the World Bank's Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, a whole host of universities: George Washington, George Mason, West Virginia, Texas Tech, Colorado, Colorado State, other NGOs. Local governments are important to get the type of institutional support that are needed. And all of these, or most of these, will be represented during the activities that we have in these days. I should mention, even though Mikel Mera mentioned it briefly, that the U.S. government is committed to supporting open mapping through its 2015 National Action Plan that focuses on engaging communities to use open mapping platforms to ensure the widest possible benefit of geographic data, and also to bring improved public services to individuals and communities that use that data. So the United States administration plans to expand its interagency collaboration and coordination with the open mapping community to promote the use of open mapping data in both domestic and international applications. So the next 3 days, we're going to have 3 separate lunchtime and following lunch activities in open mapping. The first 2 are going to be on the theme of secondary cities, and a project that my office's Humanitarian Information Unit is running. Today we're going to be talking about Mekelle, Ethiopia, land use and water issues. Tomorrow in Pokhara, Nepal, also part of the Secondary Cities project, Kathmandu Living Lab and Nama will be leading the activities there on disaster preparedness. And then day 3, Carrie Stokes is going to give a keynote. She's from the USAID Geo Center. They're working with a number of universities and youth mappers, and they'll be focusing on health issues in Mozambique. Before I introduce Mike, I do want to give a few words of thanks to a number of people who've been responsible for putting together this rather ambitious program. First of all, Tom Gerton, who's in my office, and Stan Furman from the Department of Geography and Geoinformation Science at George Mason really did heavy lifting on this. They've been working with the AAG for 6 or 8 months, I think, in trying to pull this together. And I really took my hat off to both of them and thank them for all their hard work and efforts. I also should acknowledge contribution by various researchers and academics who have been interested in open mapping and helping us out, such as Mikkel Marin, who helped get together this network of interested mapping geeks who can help us. That's a compliment in my mind. I'd also like to thank Alan McCarthy of University of British Columbia and Renee Siebert from McGill, Canadian faction, for putting together the Disrupt Geolightning talks, which will be tomorrow afternoon. And a number of other contributors and co-organizers, including the American Red Cross and its Missing Maps program, Peace Corps, World Bank, as I mentioned earlier, Community Living Labs, Teacher and MapsEnd. Really, this is reflective, as all, I think, effective collaborative mapping efforts are, of a village of interested parties. Okay, time now for the main event. Is Mike Goodchild. I'm not going to read through his bio. I think most of you are probably familiar with the fact that he started the Santa Barbara Center for Spatial Studies. For that, he worked there at directing the National Center for Geographic Information Analysis. But more importantly, I think he's probably written on volunteer geographic information and coined the term citizen sensors as much or more than anybody. And I think having his insights over a period of time that he's been engaged and steps that need to be taken to bring this diverse community of dedicated volunteers together to create open data for the common good, and maybe some pitfalls in navigating that stream. Very interesting to hear. Forward to his comments. I first met Mike, I guess, about 20 years ago when we were at the National Science Day, the National Research Council, the Mapping Sciences Committee. So since he's on the opposite coast, I don't get a chance to see or hear him much, so I'm very much looking forward to his comments, and then after Mike speaks, we'll follow up with Melinda coming up here to actually get us into the hands-on. So thank you very much.
So thank you, Lee, for the invitation to this. This is all very exciting, and it's great to be a part of it momentarily. I'm not going to take very long. I want to give you a few ideas, but I hope you can get to work pretty quickly. I also feel a bit out of water. I'm an old guy. Old guys are not supposed to learn new tricks. This is very much a new kind of activity. This is part of what's been called neo-geography. And neo-geography is about breaking down the distinction between amateur and expert. It's about human-centered mapping, map-making. I'm a paleogeographer in the sense that and here I am trying to motivate you, which is, I think, a bit of a tall order. But bear with me, and there's a few major points I'd like to make. So first, efforts like OpenStreetMap, other mapathons, more generally a lot of volunteer geographic information efforts. As I say, they're all part of this idea of neo-geography, the idea that anybody can do it. There's no longer a distinction between amateur and expert. But what's really interesting here, I think, is that you as geographers are all, in fact, experts. So we have an activity which is usually occupied by anybody, being occupied in this case by people who have a lot of geographic knowledge. And I think that creates a very interesting situation. Let me just explore that for a bit. So this, I think, makes this mapathon a very different kind of mapathon from others that are coming forward. You have geographic knowledge. You know something about how the geographic world it's constructed. Geography makes sense to you, whereas it might not make sense to others. Rather than looking at the world as a set of random scattered features, you can ask interesting questions. So you can ask, for example, why is this feature here? Why is it more likely to be an example of X rather than an example of Y? And you're in a position to do that based on what else you know about that location, what you know about the situation, nearby locations. If we were to get a bit more formal about this, I would say you're familiar with Tocqueville's first law of geography, that everything is related to everything else, but nearby things are more related than distant things. All of this helps you make sense of the geographic world. Everything is related, meaning what is here is related to what else is here, what I call the vertical context, versus horizontal context. Nearby things are more related than distant things. And both of those are examples of geographic knowledge which the average person does not have. And there are both ways, and there are many, many other ways, in which you, working in this area, this mapathon, are able to do the mapping task more intelligently, probably more accurately, better informed than the average person. And that creates, I think, a very interesting situation. And let me suggest there's an interesting research question here, which is, how is the product of this marathon, the mapathon, different from other efforts by non-geographers, but different from other efforts by geographers? Different, for example, from OpenStreetMap mapping camps, which assume that people in those mapping camps did very pure images. That's, I think, a very interesting question. It would suggest, perhaps, that what you're doing is possibly more accurate, possibly more generalizable, and would lead, I think, to some interesting conclusions. So out of that, we come to a slightly different perspective, and I know Lee has been very keen on this aspect, which is, what does this activity do for you as educators and for your students? How can a mapathon become an exercise in geographic education and knowledge acquisition? How does this help students learn geography? How can what might otherwise be a simple mechanical task turn into something truly educational? And that's something I think to think about as this mapathon evolves, because hopefully many of you will take this experience back to your campuses, back to your students, and develop exercises, learning exercises that are basic. So when, back in 2006, when I started thinking about volunteer geographic information, the key aspect of it was the volunteering. I saw VGI as a way of replacing the traditional production of geographic information. Having citizens do what the US Geological Survey or the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency had always been doing. And that I thought was really interesting and really key. How to turn what had traditionally been a professional operation into a citizen operation. But one of the reasons it works is because many of the activities are in fact fairly mechanical. Looking at a fine resolution aerial photograph and sketching the streets is a pretty mechanical operation. It doesn't require a great deal of knowledge, understanding on the part of the person doing it. And yet, on the other hand, citizens are immensely informed about the world they live in. They have associations with places, they know about places. There's an immense amount of information, which in fact doesn't get tapped by an activity like OpenStreetMap. So I've been very concerned recently that we need to develop ways of tapping that knowledge. How do you take this process and use it to tap what people know? And one instance is, of course, here, where you know something about the other. Another instance is where someone is making a map in an area they're familiar with. And the mapping exercise can tap the kind of thing they have in their heads, which is stuff that doesn't usually get mapped, but is nevertheless important. So I think this is this kind of activity is a breakthrough in terms of tapping what people know about places, the associations people have with places. People know a lot about places. There's a lot in your head about places. So if I could just sort of summarize what I've been saying, it is that I hope that as you do this, a lot is going on in your heads. A lot in terms of asking questions about the area you're mapping, about the way it's laid out, about how the various pieces fit together. Perhaps, ideally, some of this will turn into a research project of your own, because of the kinds of questions you're asking. Let me suggest that this is an area where something very interesting and fundamental goes on in the heads of an expert. It would not necessarily go on in the heads of an research. So let me just finish up with a couple of comments. I recently went to a performance of Little Prince. This is Sarah G. Berry. It's a new musical version by the son of Andrew Lloyd Webber. And I don't know if I'm sure many of you are familiar with the book, but you may not be familiar with the various ways in which Sandy G. Berry makes comments about geographers. And some of them are actually quite rude. So one of the comments is the geographer is someone who sits in his office and sends people out to distant parts of the world, and they come back and the geographer listens to what they say and possibly writes it down. And that's Sandy G. Berry's view of the geography. There's also a comment in the book about a collection of 8,000 geographers, which is just about what we have today in geography. I'm also reminded of Vermeer's famous painting of the geographer from the 17th century, which of course many geographers have used as an illustration. And I just want to note that Vermeer shows the geographer with maps on the desk and a globe behind him. But it's very important that Vermeer shows the geographers looking out the window. And of course, it's a comment about the need to connect with the real world, which is something geographers, I'm sure, feel very deeply. I'm very disappointed in no one business. But hopefully, as you do this Mapathon exercise, you are thinking beyond the content of what you see into what it really means from a geographic perspective and how your geographic knowledge can help you. Thanks very much. Any thoughts, any comments? Thanks.
I've got about 30. We can follow up. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you all for being here. I just wanted to set this up to talk about the Mapathon, what the Mapathon is going to be all about. So the focus for the first 2 days of the Mapathon is the secondary cities. And since most of you weren't here at 8 o'clock this morning when we talked about what secondary cities are, I now have the opportunity to tell you what secondary cities actually are. How many of you know what secondary cities are? There are some people who were here this morning. So secondary cities are rapidly growing cities in developing countries. They're regional hubs of governance, of logistics and production. They're transportation hubs. They're small to mid-sized cities, anywhere from 500,000 to 5 million people. And they're a place where scale matters, in the sense that a secondary city in China is not the same as a secondary city in Costa Rica. So population numbers are not what define secondary cities. Secondary cities are under-examined, under-researched, and under-mapped areas. They have informal growth patterns and have issues associated with environmental security and sustainability issues. So why map secondary cities? Well, they need it. They're emerging areas with high development potential. They're locations where national governments have identified specific needs and opportunities. And we have an opportunity to improve data and information for emergency preparedness, for human resiliency, and for urban sustainability. place that we're going to map today is Mekelle, Ethiopia. And it's part of our secondary cities projects. At the regional scale in Ethiopia, existing data and maps for infrastructure, natural resources, and land use land cover change are outdated and often highly inaccurate. These data are damaging. These data don't provide good data, essentially, for planning and response to natural disasters. Currently, parts of Ethiopia are in the worst drought seen in 50 years. Estimates by the Family Early Warning System Network suggest that at least 15 million people will face acute food insecurity in 2016. To face these challenges, the government will need access to current and developing geospatial data infrastructure to improve preparedness, to allow both the Ethiopian government and supporting organizations to formulate mitigation plans to advance and provide the necessary information to foster rapid response and expedite relief efforts. Mekelle City is located in northern Ethiopia. It was the original capital of Ethiopia and has remained an active part of Ethiopian politics. It's considered the most important city in northern Ethiopia and has close proximity to the Red Sea, Eritrea, and Sudan. It has a population of 215,000 people. It's experiencing rapid population growth and land use change, increasing the need for social services. Its water resource issues are a prolonged problem. And the government is currently strategizing improvements in water quality and quantity for the residents of Mekelle and the surrounding region. So there's very compelling reasons to map Mekelle, and you're part of a larger effort in terms of providing the necessary resource and needs for a city that needs to have this kind of mapping conducted there. So with that, I charge you, as part of the Mapathon, to launch this 3-day event for mapping secondary cities, focusing on specific needs that emphasize water resources for supply, infrastructure, and sanitation. The Horn of Africa is undergoing a severe drought, and plans are needed to address adequate supply and access to water. Then I'm going to introduce Tom Curtin, and he will explain to you how the Mapathon will work. Before I do that, I also have a shout out from Lee to also thank Matt Fox for their support and help with this. Thank you.
We're going to work on showing you guys the website so we could start mapping. But yeah, consider this room as your home base for the next 3 days. If you have any off time, feel free to stop on by on these round tables or bring food or drink in and just get some mapping in. We have a nice metrics page we'll show you later from Missing Maps, and all of the projects we'll map have a certain hashtag to it. So you could see how many buildings you've made, how many roads you trace, and who the top mappers are, which is really great. Also wanted to mention some of the sessions that are coming up. You heard about TeachOSM and OpenStreetMap in education. We have a Youth Mappers University Consortium event session that's happening Friday at 3 p.m., which is interesting. And also tomorrow we have the Disrupt Geo Lightning Talks, which is going to start right after the Mapathon at 3, and have a ton of really great speakers from industry and academia that give a bunch of 5-minute lightning talks. So to get started mapping, I'm just going to tee everything up because we have a high ratio of experienced mappers here today. And we're actually going to have an experienced mapper at each table who's going to help you, give you all the steps on how to map these mapping projects. But basically everything you need, you could just access by going to aagmapathon.org. I will demonstrate that. As Melinda mentioned about Mekelle, this is the theme for today, secondary cities. And we picked a nice project. If you scroll down, you just go to the mapping projects, and you can click on Start Mapping, It will take you straight to the project page. So if you haven't had an account, the trainers will instruct you. You just go to openstreetmap.org and you create an OpenStreetMap account. You could do that with any email you use, or you could also connect with other services such as your Facebook account, I believe. And that's really the only account you need to get started mapping. And then you could go and just click on Go to Project. And it will take you straight into the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team's tasking manager. And essentially, this is where we get started, and we divided the whole mapping area into small grids. And people will start selecting the grid, and we'll take them directly to that extended OpenStreetMap. So you'll start seeing all these little grids light up. And eventually when you're done, you'll say, oh, I'm done with this square, and then it'll turn a different color. And then that will be a signal for another person to validate your work. So again, I don't want to delay you guys, but we'll start mapping and we'll ensure that there's a lot of experienced mappers to help guide you along. So. We also have a dedicated Wi-Fi connection in this room, and in the center of each table it tells you how to connect. It basically says you could connect with a lowercase Mapathon. That gives you extra flexibility in case the main connection isn't working as fast as you want to be.
People can fill in at the tables if they want. That's more comfortable than sitting on the chairs.